Tonight's debate will explore the question, are public employees overpaid? Debating tonight's question will be Dr. Michael Rotkin, former mayor of Santa Cruz and lecturer of community studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and Dr. Lanny Ebenstein, a lecturer of economics at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and the author of Milton Freeman, a biography. We will briefly have the candidate or the debaters introduce themselves. Introduce themselves. You will have 2 minutes. Mike,
sure.
You want to start?
I'm Mike Rotkin. I came to Santa Cruz in 1969. I ran for city council in 1979 as a protest campaign, trying to make people downtown and the council aware that there were neighbors on the west side of town interested in healthcare, and surprised myself and everyone else when I came in first out of 19 candidates in that race and was elected. And since then I was elected to total of 6 terms on the city council. Because there's term limits, there were breaks in my service different times, but more or less, I guess I could summarize it by saying for 26 of the last 32 years I've been on the Santa Cruz City Council. Our mayors are elected from among the council members, and I've served as mayor 5 times in the city of Santa Cruz. I also teach at the university in the community studies program. I've been retired from that now for 2 months and a couple days. My work there involved teaching a range of different subjects related to our topic tonight and others, but I teach a Marxist theory classes in media and alternative media, and also been involved in looking at governmental operations, electoral politics. Basically, I've been the utility outfielder for my department. If students are interested in the topic and no one else is teaching that, I sort of get myself up to speed and try and teach in that area. So I've been involved in 26 budgets for the city of Santa Cruz directly, millions of dollars involved in that, and I have a fairly direct experience of working with negotiations with labor. It's worth pointing out that I'm also a member of and a leader of a union. The UCAFT represents lecturers and librarians in the UC system statewide, so I'm a labor supporter and an activist in the union movement. But as I've also said, I've been on the management side when it comes to bargaining about issues, so I've seen both sides of this question on some level, and I want to share what I've learned in this debate today. Thanks.
Thank you. Lanny?
My name is Lanny Ebenstein, and I'm also a former elected official. I served on the Santa Barbara Board of Education for 8 years, and in that capacity was able to learn quite a bit about how the actual process of negotiating between the public sector and the public sector unions occurs, and that was a very enlightening experience for me. I teach economics at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the history of economic thought, and I've also been very involved in the community there. I'm the president of the California Center for Public Policy, and what we're trying to do is forge a new way in these discussions and at least try to introduce an element of civility and the element of debate, as far as trying to have individuals of strong opinions on both sides of the issue, of both sides of issues, to see that it's possible for individuals to disagree, but at the same time to be able to have the same outlooks and intentions. So we'll find out. This is the very first debate we've sponsored, so we'll find out better tonight how it goes.
Thank you. Each of our presenters will have 20 minutes to make their case. Jan Carwin in front here is our timer, and she will keep them on track with 1 minute and 30 seconds and time. After each speaker does their 20 minutes, then we will have 10-minute rebuttals or responses from each of these speakers. You have been offered 3x5 cards in which, if you have specific questions for the speakers, please write them up, and after their talks we will have questions. I will read questions for answers by the speakers here. So let's begin with you, Lanny.
Great, very good, thank you. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to address some comments on what really is one of the important issues in California right now, and that is what are we going to do about the state of finances in our state. And unlike many people who would speak on this issue, I'm not someone who believes that what government does isn't important. My father was a teacher, I'm a teacher, and my family has certainly been involved with the state of California and with local government and statewide government. And it's precisely because what government does is so important that it's vital that public employees are paid an appropriate compensation. Although the California Center for Public Policy is identified as a libertarian organization, I really believe that the comments I make tonight could be coming exclusively from the left side of the political spectrum, because if we want to have decent quality public services, we have to find a way to pay for them, and if we're spending too much on our public employee compensation, then we're not going to be able to do that. So I guess the first question is public employee compensation currently too much in the state of California? And what I would say is, on the first place is, what are we buying right now in terms of, let's look at on the tax side how things are looking. First of all, if you look at the California sales tax, it's one of the highest in the nation. If you look at the California income tax, it's one of the highest in the nation. If you look at the California business tax, it's one of the highest in the nation. If you look at the fees and charges that the state imposes and that local governments impose, they're also very high and very expensive. So in all areas, we're really bringing in a lot of revenue to government. We're bringing it in both at the tax level, and we're bringing it in through our fees and charges. So I would say that the problem that we're experiencing in California finance right now isn't a problem of inadequate revenue. If you are taxing as much as anyone in the nation, if you have as high a state income tax and business tax and sales tax as anywhere else in the nation, the problem isn't that we're not taxing enough in the state of California. At the same time, the question is, well, are we spending too much? And I would argue that we're not spending too much, or at least that we're not spending too much on vital and essential public services. The state of California is currently trying to cut as much as $15 billion and seems to have a structural deficit in the vicinity of $10 to $15 billion. Virtually every county, city, school district, and special district in the state is facing budgetary shortfalls at this point in time. We're looking at a variety of bad choices in local government and state government as to what to do. In my home community of Santa Barbara, one of the proposals currently being considered is to reduce the number of school days by 9 days, almost 2 school weeks in all of our schools. And I think that that's completely the wrong way to go. That's a vital service. If you look at the jail populations, as a result of changes in state law, tens of thousands of state prisoners are being returned to local areas, and then the local areas are releasing tens of thousands of individuals onto the streets or into other areas. Our health services and our mental health services are being diminished. Our environmental and planning programs are being diminished. Our roads are being inadequately maintained. Our parks are not as open as long as they could be. Libraries are being closed, or they're being closed certain days during the week. Every community has a different sort of problem, but these are the sorts of issues that all communities are grappling with. I was interested to note that when I looked at the Santa Cruz Sentinel today, that many of the issues that are in it are the same issues that are in the Santa Barbara News Press every day. So the sorts of issues that are occurring in one community are happening elsewhere around the state of California. And what I would argue is that the problem is employee compensation at this point in the state of California. And until we get employee compensation resolved, that we're not going to be able to offer decent public services at a reasonable level of taxation. Once again, it's not necessary to demonize public employees. It's not necessary to say that the services that public employees provide aren't important. In fact, exactly the opposite is the case. It's precisely because what public employees do is so important, and that as individuals they are attempting to build a better society, that it's essential that we pay individuals fair wages and fair compensation. And that's why this matters so much, this discussion that we're having. So how out of line is public employee compensation in the state at this point in time? Essentially, you can say that public employees work fewer hours a day, they work fewer days a week, they work fewer weeks in a year, and they work fewer years in a career than do employees in the public sector. And their working conditions very often are not comparable to the working conditions that exist in the private sector. And then after that sort of a lifetime career in the public sector, individuals who work in the public sector are able to retire with truly unsurpassed retirement benefits, and the sorts of benefits that bankrupted General Motors. And that's in fact the course that we're on in the state of California if we continue at the current level of public employee compensation. Let's look at pensions first, because this is probably the issue that has received the most attention in recent years with respect to public employee compensation. The formula for public employee pensions is usually a certain percent times the number of years that employees worked times the final salary. And it's different for different categories of employees. So that individuals who are public safety officers, that is to say who work either for, as a police officer, a sheriff department, or in a fire department, can typically retire anywhere between the ages of 50 to 55 with 3% of their final salary times the number of years they worked, up to a maximum of 90% of their final salary. That would be through the California Public Employee Retirement System, CalPERS. So in other words, in many jurisdictions, individuals who are public safety officers can retire at as young an age as 50 years old with 90% of their final salary indexed for inflation for life. And that's just simply not a benefit that is sustainable, and it's not a benefit that is equitable either. That's a multi-million-dollar benefit, and that's not the sort of benefit that government agencies can afford. Now, it's true that public safety officers risk their lives, and so that therefore there isn't the sort of comparability to other employment positions that may exist in the private sector. But that's where, if you look at non-public safety, what their formulas are through CalPERS, it really shows you that the same thing exists, but to a slightly lesser degree. One common formula for non-public safety positions is that individuals can retire at age 55 with 2.7% of their final salary times the number of years they worked, meaning that an employee with 28 up to a maximum of 75% of final salary, meaning that individuals at the age of 55 who haven't worked in public safety, aren't risking their lives, aren't employed in positions different than individuals in the private sector, nonetheless can retire at age 55 with up to 75% of their final salary indexed for inflation for life. And again, those are multi-million-dollar pension benefits that individuals are receiving, both as public safety officers and as non-public safety officers. And that's just not affordable for the state of California if we want to continue to offer high-quality public services in the state. To give another statistic on public employee pensions, there are currently more than 15,000 pensioners, public employee pensioners in the state of California who receive $100,000 a year or more in pension from the state of California. Just these 15,000 retired public employees receive more than $2 billion a year. That is something like a fifth to a seventh or an eighth of the structural state deficit that merely 15,000 retired individuals are receiving. And that's not sustainable, that's not affordable, and these numbers are only going to increase in the years ahead. So there are almost 2 million public employees in the state of California at this point in time. Currently, it's been estimated that the average public employee who retires with 30 years service is receiving total retirement benefits of something like $67,000 per year. Some more than that, some less than that. It's sometimes said that the average amount of pension is less than what people are receiving now, but that's because many people received pensions many years ago when salaries were not as high as they were. But the people who are going out at this point in time are on average receiving something like $67,000 a year in public employee pension benefits and health benefits if they have 30 years in the system. At some point in time, if you look at the 2 million employees, the public employees in California, when we say that half of them are retired at an average of $50,000 a year, that would be $50 billion a year in pensions. And that is something that we are looking forward as a state to some years down the line, but not so many years down the line. So at this point in time, most public pensions in the state most public pension funds simply aren't sustainable. And there's several reasons why public pension funds aren't sustainable in the state of California. One is the rate of return. And what's been presumed in making these actuarial assumptions for public employee pensions is that CalPERS makes its projections on the basis that there will be something like a 7.75% return every year on its investment. That means that for most of the investments being in the stock market, this would mean that the Dow Jones would have to be at 25,000 in 2021, it would have to be at 50,000 in 2030, and it would have to be at 100,000 in 2040. That's the only way that the pension funds make sense right now as to the amount that they are projected to have to provide to retired employees. If the stock market and other investments don't increase on those sorts of ratios, then taxpayers are going to be on the hook for those remaining funds. In my home county of Santa Barbara, it's already the case that 1/3 of the county general fund is going not toward current services, but toward pensions for retired employees. And it's something that in the coming years, that figure will grow to more than 1/2. So what do you do when more than half of your general fund isn't going to current services, but is going to the pensions of former employees? That's obviously something that's not sustainable. It's not merely the rate of return that's not sustainable. It's also that individuals are living longer than ever and therefore will receive more benefits than were originally projected. Many individuals will receive benefits for a longer period of time than they worked. And the other factor that's very much affecting the public pensions at this point in time is that there aren't as many new employees coming into the system who also aren't being as paid as much, so that the funds aren't going into the pension funds at projected rates. For all of these reasons, pension funds in the state of California are in very serious trouble, and this isn't an issue that's going to go away or that there's going to be able to be minor changes that are made. There are going to have to be very serious changes made indeed in order to confront these circumstances. However, it's not just in the area of pensions that public employees are overpaid in the state. It's also in the area of working conditions compared to the private sector. Typically, health insurance is top of the line. Easily, and public in different communities have, and different government jurisdictions have different health insurance programs. But $10,000 per year is not uncommon for health benefits, which also typically would include no co-pays and vision and dental. So top of the line health insurance benefits as well as these pensions. When it comes to days work, sick leave is typically 12 days a year, and that is something that is retainable. So it's not a use it or lose it program, but rather individuals receive sick leave on the basis of about 1 day a month, and if it's not used, then it can be retained and counted toward retirement. So it's a true extra benefit that way. Holidays are 10 days per year typically in the public sector. Once again, it will vary on an agency by agency basis. Some may be 8 or 9, some may be 11 or 12, but 10 days is certainly a general number of holidays. And holidays are almost always taken. In other words, if the 4th of July falls on a Saturday or a Sunday, then it's almost always taken on the previous Friday or the following Monday. Personal necessity days in the public sector can be 1 to 4 days a year. Vacations can be 20 to 25 days per year. Add it all up, and public employees are working effectively a 4-day week in the state at this point in time. But it's not just that individuals are working a shorter work week and they're retiring at a younger age than other employees. It's that they're also having other working conditions that don't exist in the private sector. These would include such things as flexible schedules and greater job security than exists in the private sector. So in all these different ways, even without salary, even without considering salary, the jobs that are in the public sector have become some of the best jobs that there are in the community, and it's something that we can no longer afford to have these sorts of benefits, salaries, and pensions, and maintain and retain a high level of public services, and retain anything other than lower, and not have even higher taxes than we already have. In the city of Los Angeles, when speaking of salary, at one time there was something of a trade-off that individuals might have better benefits in the public sector but not as good a salary. That's no longer the case. Now the benefits are incomparable, but even the salaries are excellent. In the city of Los Angeles, the typical secretary after 5 years will be earning more than $50,000 per year. In short, the entire system just simply isn't viable or sustainable, and there's going to have to be very major reform in the coming years. The California Center for Public Policy has proposed 3 different initiatives to address these concerns. One is to raise the retirement age of individuals who are in the public sector. The public safety individuals would have their retirement raised to age 58, and everyone else would have a retirement age of the same as Social Security, just as individuals in the private sector. The second reform would be to tax existing pensions above $100,000 per year, because I don't believe that the public sector pension system was ever intended to give these sorts of benefits to individuals. And then the third reform would be to end public sector collective bargaining. Many have opposed, many strong liberals have opposed public sector collective bargaining. George Meany, the first and longtime president of the AFL-CIO, opposed public sector collective bargaining. Franklin Delano Roosevelt opposed public sector collective bargaining because they both didn't think that the circumstances in the private sector were comparable to the circumstances in the public sector, and that in the private sector you were dealing with individual entrepreneurs who you really were trying to figure out what was the appropriate share of social resources that should be distributed from the employer to the employees. That's one sort of bargaining situation. But in the case of public employment, the bargaining situation is that public employees are bargaining with the public itself, and with the power of public employees through political campaigns, they are in effect able to elect their own bosses, and there isn't that sort of check and balance that exists in the private sector. Rather, there's a circumstance whereby public sector employees are able to elect their own bosses and have an undue a share of resources that have gone to them in recent years. So there are many other reforms that can be considered. Would include such things as requiring all public employees to work a certain number of days each year, require pension funds to have reasonable rates of return projected, and require employees to pay 1/2 of premiums. It could be required to change pension plans from defined benefit to defined contribution, and also to establish maximum retirement benefits. But to conclude where we started, What public employees do is extremely important, and it's for this reason that it's important that they're not overpaid. It would be possible if public employees were paid at rates comparable to the private sector to have both reduced taxes and increased services rather than increased taxes and reduced services as at present. Thank you.
Well, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you about this issue. I want to just start by saying that a lot of this has to do with perceptions that people have rather than the actual factual reality of what's going on in terms of people's compensation in the public sector. But I want to start by saying that there certainly is a need for some reform in the area of public employee compensation, and it's not like the system's perfect and there's nothing that should be done to change it. So let me start by recognizing some real problems that do exist. First of all, in many situations, the problem of what's known as single-year spiking. People in their last year of employment find out a way to get some extra hours, more than they've done for almost their whole career, and then their pension's based on the amount of money that they made in that last year. And that's the way the CalPERS system works. So that can be problematic, and I think that's an area that requires some reform. The university, for example, has the last 3 years of your employment, which might be a better way to sort of go after that issue. There certainly are examples of exceptional abuse that exist in the system. Bell, California, or something like that, where there's basically corruption and people are being paid outrageous amounts of money and deals are being made in back rooms and things happening. That goes on in the private sector and the public sector. It needs to be addressed. There's a problem, I think, currently with California, the level of California public safety employees, which my colleague here mentioned, which I agree can be a problem. That doesn't necessarily mean that that pension is too rich or too valuable. It may mean that if police officers and firefighters want to have a system that gives them 30 years of work at 3%, which would be 90% of their pay at 55 or 50 years old when they leave, maybe they have to pay a larger premium into that system so that they share more of the burden with the taxpayers in terms of maintaining that system. And of course I'll come back and talk about this, but it may be that it's not so easy to think about what happens to firefighters and police when they retire beyond 50 years old. They've mostly beaten their bodies up pretty badly, and I know that directly. I wouldn't have thought that before I served on the city council all those years, but that can be an issue. Of course, there's a huge problem that we have in terms of our healthcare costs, which could be solved by having a single-payer health system that everybody in the society, not just people in the public sector, would be able to reduce the cost of healthcare coverage to a much more reasonable level. But having said that, I'm going to go right to this issue of, like, are in fact public employees paid more than people in the private sector? It's kind of an essential question before we debate how good or bad that might be. And what I've done is looked at a number of different studies. And first of all, you can study comparability or comparability between the private and the public sector in a number of different ways. One way to do that is to try and match jobs up and say, well, how much does this job in the public sector pay versus the similar job in the private sector? That's difficult to do because some jobs match perfectly. You can get an assistant accountant and it's the same training and job more or less in both areas. But there's an awful lot of jobs in the public sector that don't match jobs in the private sector and vice versa. So the methodology that more and more people have focused on is what is known as sort of person-to-person matching. What are the qualities that go on? And it's true that people in the public sector are paid, if you just look at it grossly, at a higher rate. Their compensation overall is at a higher rate than in the private sector. But if you control the comparison for a number of demographic factors, and that's the studies that the most serious studies look at this issue, and one of those factors we're going to be looking at. You have to make sure that you compare people who have similar levels of education, people who have similar levels of training, people who have similar levels of experience on the job, and broad kind of occupational similarity in the kinds of work that they're doing. And when you make those kinds of matchups and try and study, and the term for this technically is econometrics, where you actually like do what's known as a regression analysis, and you take the statistics and you hold them up against, this is part of what I'm sure he does in his work as well, you hold that up against the actual comparison that's going on. This is what we find. Before the mid-60s, people in the public sector were woefully underpaid, and in terms of comparison to the private sector, paid far less than the private sector, literally at the level of a scandal at both the level of federal, state, and local government employees. That began to change in the middle of the 1960s, largely because of union organizing. Also, public opinion began to change about how much we should pay our teachers and other public employees. And so that began to shift, and more of the public employees' salaries and benefits began to rise relative to the private sector. So the first serious large-scale study that was done, the econometric study, was done by S.P. Smith in 1976. So this is about 15 years after we start to see the change in what's going on. This is across the country and as well in California. And what we discovered in the study that she did was that, first of all, that state workers, the people who are government employees who work for the state of California, the state of Illinois, the state of Florida, and so forth, by 1976, they were getting somewhat comparable salaries to people in the private sector. The people in local government employment were still lagging against private sector employment, and the number that in the study shows up is they're about 8% behind the salaries for people in the private sector. Another major study was done in 1994 by Bellman and Haywood, and what it shows is the gap was growing again between public and private sector employees, and especially for males, interestingly enough. In 2009, Lewis and Galloway did another major study that combined state and local employees and measured them against the private sector. And what it found is that in 44 of 50 states, total compensation for the public employees was less than for the private employees. So if you take these pension plans, which are generally better than the private sector pension plans, and the health plans that are better than the private sector, and you cost out, what do they actually cost? And you make that part of the compensation package that a person's getting, and compare that full compensation cost for the public employee versus the private sector employee, what you find in 2009 is that in 44 out of 50 states, the public sector was lagging the private sector, not being paid better than the private sector. Again, if you control for how much education people have and other kinds of issues. So how can that be? Because in fact, it turns out people in the public sector are much better educated generally than people in the private sector. The jobs require a higher level of education, and as a result, people are rewarded for those years they spend in school getting BAs and so forth. One simple measure of that is the college graduation rates for public employees are about twice those of college graduation rates in the private sector. So the most interesting study, what I want to focus on with the short period of time we have up here, is a study that was done in 2010, just 2 years ago. Bender and Haywood. This is a study done by the Center for State and Local Excellence, and here were their findings. If you look just at wages, state employees were paid 11% less. I mean, this is again a national study. 11% less than employees in the private sector. Local government employees were paid 12% less than people in the private sector. There's been a huge decline in basically public employee relative to the private sector over the last 20 years. If you add in benefits and look at that question, and public employees come up, they'll be a little better because they do have a better benefit system than most people in the private sector. So what we find are that the state employees are still put their benefit package into it and cost it out. 6.8% less compensation overall than the private sector, and the local sector, local government employees 7.4% less than the private sector. So those are the facts. That's what's going on when you actually study this question, take the salaries, take the benefits, cost them out, figure out how they compare. In fact, it's not the case that public sector employees are paid better than people in the private sector. It's simply not true. Now, so why do people believe it? Why is that going on? It seems because it's a generally held view. Gosh, these public sector employees are getting too much money. What's happening here? And the answer is a couple different things happening at the same time. Number one, it's true that in recessions, public sector employee benefits and salary tend to fall slower than in the private sector when you go into a recession. They tend to get laid off a little slower than it happens in the private sector. Their wages fall, or they get reductions of a variety of kinds, or their benefit packages either get reduced or stalled in a recession to lesser than the private sector. So if there's a recession, typically you'll find layoffs taking place in the private sector first, and the public sector lags by 6 months to a year typically behind. And that's been true of every recession we've had in the last 40 years. And at the same time, the public sector comes out of recessions more slowly. So when everybody else in the private sector is starting to get picked up and there's starting to be more employment and jobs, they don't restart rehiring people in the public sector or start to give them new benefits or deal with their pay issues and stuff, which are then lagging during that period for something like a half a year to a year following the end of that recession. So whenever you go into a recession, people are most likely to start thinking, gosh, these public employees have it really well, because for at least a period of time, it looks like they're not being hit as hard. And of course, in a recession, the people who are paying taxes start to think, I don't have enough money to deal with my own needs, and the government's taxing me, so there starts to be a perception of like, how can I get my taxes down? Why is this happening? Why am I paying these taxes? And people look for easy scapegoats and targets. So public employees become a possibility. Also, this is really important. We've been barraged since the middle 1970s, even early 1970s, with an anti-government, anti-tax wave of, I'll call it misinformation. I'll stop short of calling it propaganda, but a strong public, through the media that's controlled by people that support this point of view, through, in California, certainly through the Jarvis Dam Tax Association and other groups. I'm happy to hear that my colleague here doesn't think we should be cutting government, but certainly that's a message that's been coming generally that's pretty widely spread, that government doesn't do anything for you, and why do they get all this money, and how come I'm paying these taxes, and I have all these costs in my life, and so forth. So it's not surprising that people start to, when there's a problem, when you have a recession, people start thinking, what's causing my problems, what's going on? Somebody's doing better than me, and you start to see literally envy and people unhappy about the fact that everybody's not suffering at the same level. Perhaps in a bigger scope, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this reality. You've probably all heard this quote or something close to it from Thomas Jefferson from 1790. It's like, that government is best which governs least. What do you need government for anyway? And it's true. In 1790, most people in this country, leaving out the unfortunate Native Americans and the slaves, but all the rest of the people in this society, 80% of the population did not work for a wage or salary. Think about that for a moment. They owned a farm or a small craft shop or business. Only 1 person out of 5 actually worked for any kind of wage or salary in the United States in 1790. People live in extended family networks. And in this kind of a context, you don't need to have programs for senior citizens because the family looks after the senior. In fact, the seniors can be economically viable, as can children. You can send them out to collect the eggs or do something in a small family garden or something. Because you're an extended family, your family looks after you. And because you have an economic basis, because you live on a farm or you have some kind of a craft shop or some kind of small business, you can support an extended family. If you have people who have mental health problems, if there's people with other kinds of issues, disabilities in their life, the extended family network in 1790 takes care of those issues as best they can. You don't need a health care system. In fact, you probably better not call the doctor, because they're likely to bleed you for your problems, which is going to make your problem worse than before you call for medical help. So the kinds of things that government does today were not necessary in 1790, but they're desperately necessary now. People no longer mostly own small businesses. About 80% of the population, actually it's about 86% of the population works for a wage or salary. So a very small percentage are left as small business people or the owners of very large corporations. Vast majority of people live in not extended families, but either nuclear families, and even that's on the way out. People live in single-parent families, in serial families where they have more than 2 parents going on and so forth. And so what happens to children in terms of their education? That's the other thing I should say. You don't need an educational system really in 1790, not for economic reasons. If you want to read, it's to be able to read the Bible, or to sort of understand the world better in broad terms, to become an intellectual person. Very few people go to college. You don't need it for your job. Your grandmother or your grandfather can teach you everything you need to know about work. That's not the case in the world in which we live. You need an extensive educational system. The parents are typically working. Somebody has to look after these kids who are 3 years old. You didn't need that in 1790. You need that now. So think about the kind of governmental institutions that get created when you have to deal with people being unemployed, people finding themselves sick, people finding themselves old and no longer able to be economically productive. I won't go through the whole list of it, but it's huge when you start to think about what that level of activity is that goes on. And so we end up with a very large government that ends up going from almost nothing in 1790 to something like between a fifth and a quarter of our economy is involved in governmental operations of either federal, state, or local level. And it's really important work that people are doing there in terms of what goes on. So what's the solution to this situation that we find ourselves in? I'll come back to some of this in the rebuttal, but as Lanny's laying out here, his argument is basically we don't have, we shouldn't be cutting government services, we shouldn't be raising people's taxes, it's not a revenue problem, it's sort of a question of how we spend the money we've got, too much is going to the employees. Well, you could cut government salaries and government benefits below the private sector level, turn them into sort of servants that are not getting the same compensation that everybody else in society gets, where you can compensate them fairly, like everybody else in society, and decide that in fact it is a revenue problem that we're confronting right now. And yes, California has high nominal taxes. If you look at our tax rates in California, they are higher than many other states. But if you look at the real tax rates being paid by corporations and being paid by wealthy individuals, it's far below what it was in the past. In fact, if you take the real tax rates being paid by California corporations and wealthy individuals in 1980 and went back to that, I'm not talking about socialist confiscation here, I'm talking about taxes people used to pay in the state as recently as 1980, we would have a surplus in California right now in terms of the taxes we were collecting and not a deficit. So the real problem we have is avoidance of taxes by corporations and wealthy individuals, and if in fact we address that question, we would have enough money in the public sector to be able to pay the people that do the hard work that we need to have done, paid at a decent wage, and we might actually get them back up to comparability with the private sector, which they've lagged behind since 1976. And that would be a much better way to approach this problem than thinking about how we can cut their salaries and their benefits even further than they've been cut so far. We'll come back when there's a rebuttal, and I'll get into some other kinds of issues, and appreciate the chance to at least put the first argument forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have 10 minutes to do a response.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I appreciate very much the opportunity to offer some comments. And I think that the most interesting comments were that, one, it's not a problem of inadequate services where we seem to agree. It's not that there's services that should be cut. That doesn't, there seems to be agreement on the panel. Where we disagree is that I don't think it's a revenue problem that California faces right now. And we already have sales taxes, depending on how much the local areas add on to the state sales tax, but we already have sales taxes of anywhere from 8 to 9% throughout the state of California. Our corporate and our personal income taxes are among the highest in the nation. So if we have higher taxes, who's that going to affect? Governor Brown is proposing a half-cent increase in the sales tax this November, as well as an increased tax on higher income individuals. However, looking just at the sales tax portion of that proposal, the sales taxes disproportionately affect lower socioeconomic individuals because they spend a larger portion of their income on taxable items. So that when individuals say that what we should do is raise revenue, and they say that we should raise revenue by increasing the sales tax, what they're really saying is we should have poor people pay a larger proportion of their income in sales tax in order to provide the current level of government services, and I don't think that's the right way forward. With respect to increasing the income taxes on higher income individuals, it's already the case that the state of California is losing many jobs and many businesses to other states because of our higher taxes than other states. If we have even higher taxes on high income individuals, then we're likely to see even more jobs lost to other states, and that isn't going to be good for our economy. So I want to say that there's a different approach in terms of, one approach would be to say we don't need these services. That isn't the approach that I'm taking. The other approach is to say we should pay public sector employees less than they're being paid now. And many studies have been done, and it's true that those studies, or some of them, have shown that public employees are not paid disproportionately more or significantly more than employees in the private sector. But that's often with methodologies that are suspect when you start to look into them. And as Mike indicated, education is an area where public employees tend to be more well educated than workers in the private sector. But that doesn't mean that public employees who are educated aren't paid more than comparable employees who are educated in the private sector. And public education is one of the best examples, in the sense that the public school teachers are paid much more than private school teachers, even though their qualifications may not be significantly greater than teachers in the private sector. So that's a case where if you factor all public school teachers, who are a very large share of public employees in the state of California as elsewhere, they're a very large share of all public employees. If you factor them into all public employees, you can say, well, they're not being paid as well as other employees with college degrees. However, when you look at the comparable employees in the private sector, then what you see is that public sector teachers are paid significantly more than private sector teachers, and that's the meaningful or the relevant criterion. With respect to, are public sector employees paid more than positions in the private sector, and is there sort of any sort of difference, or is there rough comparability? I simply don't think that the existing methodologies have really gotten to the root of the problem. Why is it the case that at this point in time in the state of California, there literally can be hundreds or thousands of applicants for any public sector position that comes open, particularly in the area of public safety or working for correctional facilities, where there truly are sometimes thousands of applicants for every position that's open? That's not because those are positions that are comparable to positions in the private sector. That's because those are positions that are paid much more than any sort of position in the private sector. And when an individual can retire at the age of 50 to 55 with 90% of final salary indexed for inflation for life, that is a multi-million-dollar benefit. That's a $2 or $3 million check that we're writing to every single public safety officer in the state of California, and we simply can't afford to do it any longer. Similarly, when you look at the non-public safety employees, once again, public safety is a somewhat unique situation, and there aren't as many comparable positions in the private sector. But when you look at a secretary in the public sector compared to a secretary in the private sector, the ability to retire at as young as at the age of 55 with 75% of final salary indexed for inflation for life, that can be $1 million benefit, $1 million check to every single public sector employee in the state. That simply isn't sustainable, and it's something that is going to result in fewer school days, less road maintenance, less environmental protections, less programs for the homeless. It's going to result in fewer people in jails. It's going to result in fewer firefighters, fewer cops on the street, fewer correctional facilities, all the public services that we demand and intend and what we would like to see for ourselves. So I think that it simply isn't the case, when you really look at the data, that there isn't this inequity and this disequilibrium between the public sector and the private sector. And then all of this really doesn't take into account these different rates of return that are being projected in the public sector pension plans, which once again presume that we're going to have 100,000 Dow by the year 2040, or a 50,000 Dow by the year 2030, or a 25,000 Dow by the year 2021. Unless you think those sorts of returns on investment are possible, then the system is even in far worse condition than it is. So in other words, the problem with much of the data in comparing the public sector to the private sector is that the public sector pension benefits use an artificially inflated rate of return, which isn't incorporated into the models for how much these benefits are ultimately going to cost the taxpayer. So I think that this really is a factual question, and people are going to see with their own eyes in the coming years what's going to happen when we have increasing numbers of employees retiring as a result of the baby boom generation reaching its retirement ages. That we're going to have more people retiring every year, and we're not going to have, if we don't have the return in the stock markets that are anticipated, and the rates of return are lower, then every government agency in the state is going to face very difficult economic times as they have to make up these shortfalls. And there are basically two alternatives that are currently being placed on the table. One alternative is we should reduce services. Once again, that's not the approach here of either speaker. We're not in favor of reducing services. To be sure, I would argue that there's services that could be provided more effectively, but I'm sure Mike would argue there's services that could be provided more effectively as well. That's not the question. The question is then, are we going to raise taxes in order to pay for pensions and other benefits? And that's where I say the answer is no. That the answer is we have to hold the line to a very considerable extent and say we're not going to continue a system whereby individuals work fewer years during their career, they work fewer days, fewer hours during the working year than other employees, yet they are able to retire at a younger age than other employees with better benefits. And by all means, there are things that can be done to improve public employee pension compensation in the state as far as eliminating spiking and other reforms along those lines. However, the basic inequity is that it simply doesn't make sense to allow one group of employees in the economy to retire 10 to 15 years at a younger age by 10 to 15 years than other employees in the economy. And until that basic inequity is alleviated, we're not going to have an adequate or a satisfactory resolution of the financial problems that increasingly affect every single government agency in the state. Thank you very much.
A lot of the issues that we're confronting here have to do with whether or not this pension system that we have is affordable or not. I don't believe it's affordable for most local communities to pay their police officers and their firefighters a 3% at 50 pension plan if there's not a big contribution on the part of firefighters and police officers to that pension system. I agree with my colleague here that it's in fact not affordable under these kinds of circumstances. So the city of Santa Cruz, and this would again disprove the idea that somehow the public bodies are incapable of dealing with the folks that get them elected to office. City of Santa Cruz in the last year negotiated new arrangements with the firefighters and police department in the city of Santa Cruz. And in fact, they didn't reduce their pension program. What they did was step up and pay out a larger share of the premiums necessary to support that kind of a system. And as somebody who started in government not necessarily having a great deal of appreciation of the experience of police officers or firefighters, it took me a while to understand what those jobs entail. And it's not just that they face the risk of death or that they're in dangerous positions, although that's the case. There are also private sector jobs, coal mining and others, that are very dangerous. It's the fact that they're beat up by the time they're 50 years old. Firefighters have not been sleeping regularly for their whole adult life. Police are called out on these double shifts at times due to problems. The number of calls going to the police department goes up dramatically, and it's a very, very difficult job to do. And over time, eventually, they really burn out on the job. And you don't want to have police officers out there or firefighters who are on their last legs or barely holding on, because then you start to have disability payments to them and they start to have injuries on the job that go up dramatically. So the pension reform there is not to get rid of these pensions because they're too generous to people to allow them to retire at 50. The problem is that, in fact, that the cost of them is something that local governments can't afford, so they have to get the police officers and the firefighters to buy into the cost of that program if they want that kind of retirement. And that's exactly what happened in the city of Santa Cruz, and needs to happen in some other cities, I'm sure, as well. That's beginning to happen in a lot of other cities. In fact, it's under consideration in all 4 of the cities in our county. Lanny said a couple times, that if you want to get the return rate from your investments that would allow you to keep this pension system going, you're going to have the Dow at, I think he said 21,000 or something like that. Last year, not a particularly great year. CalPERS had a rate of return on their investment of 21.7%. They stated their expectation at 7.5%. In fact, they earned 21.7% on their investments in the CalPERS system. So this is one of the worst years in record, in terms of, not the worst ever, but it's among the worst years on record in terms of how that pension system's doing. As it turns out, if you look at the last 20 years, 66%, 66 cents on the dollar for the pension plan came from investments. 21 cents came from employer contribution, that's taxpayer money going into these pensions. And the member contributions covered 13 cents, or 13% of the cost of it, which suggests that the majority of how pension plans work is investment in the system. The system turns a reasonable rate of return if you invest wisely. It doesn't require the Dow going to 21,000. At the rates that we're getting right now, last year and a bad year would be sufficient to cover this. The CalPERS system is currently 75% covered for if everybody retired tomorrow, which is not going to happen, in the entire CalPERS system, they would be able to pay off 75% of the cost of that pension for all those people. Well, they're not going to all retire next year. They're going to retire over the next 30 years. And as that happens, there's plenty of money in this pension system to pay these things out to people. How do local governments afford their share? If it's the 21 cent share or whatever that share might be, comes back again to this question of taxes. I've shared Lanny's view about the regressive nature of sales taxes. I disagree with Governor Brown. I don't think we should be raising the sales tax on working people for the necessities they have in life. I think we should be raising the taxes on corporations, and as I said earlier, it should be taxes that are hit people that can afford to pay them and are not necessarily going to drive them away. Let's take, for example, an oil extraction tax. California doesn't have any tax on the oil that's taken out of our ground. There's a huge oil extraction tax in these progressive states of Texas under George Bush that passed, Alaska under Sarah Palin. These are these radical leftists that are trying to destroy the corporate world, I'm sure. Basically, an oil extraction tax, the oil companies can't go somewhere else with their business and run away and get the oil someplace else. They're trying to get it out of the ground in California, and therefore they have to stay here. There's no place else they can go, and we should tax them for it like almost every other major, in fact, every other major oil-producing state does. On the question of just general corporate taxes, again, the rate. The important thing to look at is not the tax rate in California, but the actual, not the nominal rate, but the actual rate that's being paid. Because people have loopholes. They get out of paying their taxes. I'm not telling anybody in this room something new, that people make lots of money in corporations that make a lot of money often pay zero taxes, or even get rebates on their taxes. And so I'm not in favor of raising taxes on working people in California. I don't think it's necessary. When I gave that figure about going back to the tax rates in 1980, I'm not talking about raising taxes on working people. I'm talking about raising taxes on people that can afford to pay higher taxes and used to pay them, until they found ways around it, which has been the problem not just in this state, but across this country. Now, so what's my solution to this situation? This apparent gap, the feeling that people in the private sector have about the government taking taxes from them, which it does, and spending on the public sector, my view is we should be doing more union organizing in the private sector. If the private school teachers are paid badly, they should get organized like the public school teachers, and they'll have to be able to command a reasonable salary for the work that they do and not be paid as they are, starvation wages in most private schools. And some of the best private schools pay their teachers pathetically. It needs to be addressed. That organizing in the private sector is something that used to happen. If you compare blue-collar industrial jobs in America to the public sector, they're paid way more than the public sector. But that's a losing sector in our economy. Our problem is that we don't have union organizing in the service sector or in the new electronic sectors and the kind of new areas of our economy that are opening up. And as long as that's the case, people are not going to be able to command the kinds of salaries that they need to be able to compete effectively with what's being paid in the public sector. And again, I'm not basing this on raising the average person's taxes, but I'm basically going back to a real tax rate that would support this kind of governmental spending. Okay, good. One or two more points. As far as unions, or the idea of not allowing the public sector to be unionized, so I left it over here. Get it. I'm going to read a quote about unionization. Where free unions and collective bargaining are forbidden, freedom is lost. What radical left-winger said that? Ronald Reagan in 1980 in a speech in front of the Statue of Liberty. Now, at the time, he was thinking about Poland and solidarity, but the fact of the matter is that I believe the statement's accurate everywhere. People, you don't have an automatic right to be unionized. You have to get organized and do it. I don't think unions have the right to, make demands on society that can't be responded to. I know people know in this town will know that I've often stood up to unions when I thought their demands were unreasonable, and that happens from time to time. But our experience has been that the unions are quite tractable, quite willing to talk seriously about what to do when there's an economic crisis. And we bargained new arrangements with every union in the city of Santa Cruz recently and brought their pay actually down. First they had a 10% furlough, which actually meant that they were getting 10% less pay but working 10% less. But this year it was renegotiated to basically do a 10% cut without the furlough. So in the end, they basically took a 10% cut because they recognized the reality of the local budget of the city of Santa Cruz. I think reasonable public officials can bring unions to that kind of agreement. Union people are not stupid. They understand you can't pay them the money you don't have. So my view of this is that the public sector is not being overpaid. In fact, they should be paid more in some cases than they are, but for the most part, the issue is we have to raise the revenues necessary to have the kind of governmental services that people demand and need. And I think that's quite feasible, and again, not by extraordinary rates, but by what people used to pay in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have questions? When the wealthy and corporations take their wealth overseas, the loss of revenue is felt locally. Why should public employees bear the cost by layoffs and cutbacks in public services? Is the issue distribution of wealth and playing fair across the board?
I'll start.
You want to start?
I think that what the question is sort of that, there's a number of questions within that question, but I don't think that public employees should bear the brunt of those kinds of problems. I think we live in a global system, and not every local community has the ability to control everything that goes on. We've lost some businesses here locally to international situations, but more often than not, they've gone somewhere else in the United States, to Texas or back east. We lost, I won't go through the list of them. But my own view is that we could do a lot more in this country to stop these companies from leaving here, going into other places, by not having policies that reward people, which we do have at the federal level. They actually get tax breaks when they open up new business, take a business from an American city and move it to Taiwan or to Sri Lanka or something. So I think we have more ability to control those runaway shops than we realize. The Obama administration says at least they're interested in doing that. We haven't seen any real action in that direction, but I think that's something we can get on top of. And there's always going to be some slippage in that way, but then you try and find out what it is that you can attract people to your town to do instead that will bring revenue into your community. We would actually be fine in the city of Santa Cruz if we didn't have the state stealing money from us. I mean, that's the context that we're in, where even though we have the same thing every other city in California does, losing businesses and so forth, we're actually doing okay with our local revenues. Our real problem is the way that the state has reduced the revenues that we had coming to us otherwise. They've taken a bunch of taxes that used to be local taxes and made them into state taxes. Move those things away from us.
Well, I'm in a little difficult position because I'm both a limited government guy and yet at the same time I'm an egalitarian. So I'm not opposed to the notion of higher taxes on individuals with more resources, and I would be inclined to agree that our society has moved in the wrong direction in recent decades as far as having tax rates lowered for higher individuals with higher taxes. But at the same time, having said that, while that remains my philosophical predisposition, I think that whenever you have some states and some countries that have more advantageous working conditions than other states and other communities, that you're going to have a flow of jobs and economic resources to the areas where there is more economic opportunity. So that I think that the idea of the state of California raising its corporate taxes or its income taxes at this point in time would probably do more harm than good. That isn't to say that might not be an appropriate policy at the national level. What it is to say is that at the state level, it could very well be a counterproductive policy. So, and I'm not sure if that's to say that it's the public employees have to take the brunt of that, but someone has to take the brunt of it, and it's something that, and I would say that's probably going to be more likely in the private sector. But in either event, I think that it's almost inevitable that if some areas have more advantageous economic circumstances for businesses and for individuals, that's where individuals and businesses will go, and we're not benefited then by trying to say, well, that's not the way that it should be, but that's the way that it is.
Okay, the next question is, has a risk-adjusted comparison of compensation ever been done for public versus private? There's a risk of job loss, risk of insurance, things like that.
If there's anything you can raise, someone's done a study on it, but I'm not familiar with those studies, so I'm sure that they're out there, though.
Probably, but at the same time, I think that if you look at the working conditions of public employees, not just in the area of monetary compensation and benefits, but in such intangible areas as job security or potential loss of job, that those are areas that public employees will have benefits over employees in the private sector.
How do the unions look at this? Because it's obviously a basic financial reality that isn't affordable, looking at our state budget and all of those costs. How do unions look at this, and do they come up with any real ways to deal with?
I think it's fair to say that there's a huge difference among unions, just like there is among people. And you've got unions who, if they have the political clout to demand something, even if they think it's, going to cause a major economic crisis, they'll go for it anyway. And you see some examples of that in the state of California. I haven't seen that at the local level in Santa Cruz, or heard about it in other kind of local unions. For the most part, I mean, again, teachers' unions at public employee unions in terms of cities or counties, even at the state level, you can see from the negotiating that's been going on over the last 2-3 years that most of them have been involved in takeaways. And the question is, how much is going to get taken away? And I think we're in a situation where we had a situation in this town, for example, a while back when the bus drivers union decided to go on strike, and they're the 6th highest paid or 5th highest paid bus drivers in the country, a pretty small little town. I like the fact, I was on the transit board as well. I like the fact that people are well paid to drive buses and we get high quality people to do it, but at some point what they were asking for was simply not reasonable. The transit district decided not to give in to that. We had a terrible situation for about 3 weeks. Nobody was happy about that, but in the end, the Transit District Board did not accept the demands of the union, and the end result of that was the unions have been a lot more reasonable in recent years. They're not giving up on defending their members or fighting for better wages and so forth, but they're no longer in some position where they think whatever they want, no matter how whether it'll end up cutting routes or whatever else happens. So again, I think the political process is such that eventually they do get disciplined, I'll use that term, and realize that they can ask for reasonable things, but they can't ask for unreasonable things. And again, like everything else, you'll find a few exceptions where people have been unions have been out of line and demanded things that are not particularly reasonable. Probably one, with 10 seconds left, the prison guards union, which started off this 3% at 30 thing, which then went to the police and fire afterwards. I think we're making unreasonable demands. There's such a strong union at the state level. They were successful at getting that through, and I don't think they should have. And I think Gray Davis, a Democrat like I am, should not have allowed that to happen, but he did. So there's examples of abuses and things that have gone wrong. I don't think they're general in the system.
Thank you. Lanny?
Well, I think that on the issue of unionization, it's very troubling because once again, someone can be an advocate of private unions and say that we should have stronger private unions in the United States, and yet at the same time say that public unions have become too strong and too powerful and have become compensated too much. And it's interesting that as a matter of fact, as the power of private unions has diminished, the power of public unions has increased, such that there are now more public employees who are unionized than there are workers in the private sector who are unionized. And that's a complete reversal from historical trends. So I guess my feeling is that when it comes to unionization, the concept of collective bargaining was not originally intended to pertain to the public sector. That was only a later development, and that it can very well be the case that if we had stronger if we had stronger private sector unions, that might be a good thing, but that doesn't mean that it's a good thing to have stronger public sector unions.
Are pensions indexed for inflation, or are they negotiated in terms of the inflation increases?
My knowledge is that in California, about half of the pension plans are indexed for inflation, about half of them aren't. And it depends where you are in the economy, which parts of it are going. So they're not all indexed, but about half of them are.
So each group sort of negotiates?
Yeah, basically the plan.
Every city or every?
Right, there's not one pension plan. There's a PERS. The PERS pension plan, which covers a lot of public employees in California, for example, is an index plan, so you do get increases over time. But there's a lot of other, public sector. The University of California has a separate pension plan. There's a bunch of other groups that have them, so they're all different.
They might be capped and all. So in terms of the financial impact to the taxpayer of paying more as these.
Right. Well, again, the indexing would be that the money you take home when you retire doesn't become nothing by the time you're 20 years into your retirement or something. So that's the concept, at least. I don't know what numbers.
Yeah, my understanding is a little bit different than that, but I believe that both CalPERS and CalSTRS, which are California State Teachers Retirement System, are the two largest public employee pensions in the state, and I believe that both of those do in most of their plans have indexing for their employees. So it really is the case that at a time when many employees are finding, in both the public sector and the private sector, are finding their wages capped or even reduced, that retirees are finding their pensions increasing. And I'm not sure if that's a very good principle or a sustainable one.
What is the percentage of pensions receiving the maximum retirement of 90% at 50 years?
What percentage of firefighters and police get it? It's a very small percentage, actually. Most of them end up retiring before they get their full 30 years in. So they get it still gives them a higher pension than they otherwise would have. But the number that actually finish out their 30 years, retire at the end of it and stuff, is less than half in the city of Santa Cruz for our firefighter and police department. I don't know I've never looked at those numbers for other places, but I'm guessing that's probably typical of what happens. So people tend to retire after they've had 27 years in, 28, 25, whatever, and they end up getting a better pension than they would if they had a lesser system. But most of them do not stay for the full 30 years because they get burned out or they have injuries or other kinds of problems before they get there.
Well, once again, to some extent, we're looking at past employees who retired when circumstances were different than they are now, compared to what employees are doing at this point in time after the benefits have become as generous as they have become. And I don't know what the percentage of police and fire who retire after 30 years is at this point in time. However, as a result of golden handshakes and sick leave days that are counted and so forth, it is possible for people with less than 30 years to have 30 years of credit. But there's no question that individuals who work for public safety are able to retire at a younger age than almost anyone else with very generous pensions, which truly are worth millions of dollars in terms of, there's no gainsaying that. And that's something that, in our view at least, isn't sustainable for the state. In Santa Barbara, we have a big issue, which I'm sure is an issue in other communities, as to who's responsible for crossing guards. Is it a city responsibility because the kids haven't gone to the school yet, or is it a school responsibility because these are kids who are going to school? So every year there's a fight between the city council and the school board over who's responsible for that, and depending on whose budget is in a better shape, is the agency that takes responsibility. There's only a $50,000 a year cost in this area for the several thousand children in the Santa Barbara Elementary School District. One pension can be more than that amount. So I think that the area of public safety pensions in particular is an area where there has to be major reform.
Negative perceptions are caused by unrealistic revenue assumptions. Would you agree with that?
Oh,
Sure. Yeah, no, I do, and I think that goes to the issue of what's going to happen with the stock market. And it's true that CalPERS has had several good years in the last several years, but that's because the stock market had declined so significantly that we were rebounding from a hole. So it's always easier to build the stock market back up to where it has been than to break new ground. But the bottom line is that unless we have the same sorts of gains continuing into the future, we're going to have a far lesser prospect than is now currently anticipated.
I think there's a lot of misinformation out there that's misleading about the state of most pension plans. There's the conservative political forces in this state, and I've seen it's happened elsewhere, have basically changed the rules so that you now have to account for your pensions as if everybody was going to retire tomorrow. In other words, you have to, and so they'll say, well, the pension plan's not fully funded, because if everybody retired tomorrow, you didn't have the money to pay them all, which is, of course, an unrealistic assumption. So now city governments and everybody else has to sit down there and actually calculate out, well, okay, what would our liability be for the total pension if everybody left tomorrow? But it's a ridiculous exercise that's been forced on the government by conservative forces that makes no sense whatsoever. A pension plan is paid out over time, which I mentioned before. Lanny mentioned earlier, this is tied to this issue about, well, when the unionization took place in this country mainly in the 30s, nobody thought about the public sector being organized. He mentions Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't necessarily in favor of that. We also didn't believe that farm workers should be organized, that people that worked in agriculture in general, that anybody who worked in domestic service should be allowed to be organized, anybody in the service sector should be allowed to be organized. Basically, the unions that had the naked strength in the industrial cities in the north to fight for the rights for unions got them. They were able to get away with it. And the deal that got cut with the Democratic Party full of Dixiecrats from the South managed to stop the unionization of most sectors of our economy that had African Americans in it. So as a result, we have a situation where the idea was, why should the public sector organize? Well, why should they not organize? Why should anybody that's working a job not be in a position to get together with other people and come up with some collective understanding of what their interest is and work on it together? That's a basic American right, the First Amendment, the right of free association. And the idea that it didn't happen in the 30s and it took another 30 years for it to happen, that's sad rather than something we should be proud of.
How do you adjust salaries for the high cost of living areas like Santa Barbara and Santa Cruz?
Very difficult question, and because you don't really receive more revenue necessarily, and from a state level at teaching, for example, in schools, the revenue limit is the same throughout the state of California, irrespective of whether you're a high income area or a lower income area. So it's very difficult to do that. My own approach is somewhat more local control, so that if local areas wish to pay more in taxes and have higher salaries, they would be able to do that. And if they didn't wish to do that, they wouldn't have to do that. So I would in general tend to favor a more localized system of the provision of public services than at the state level or at the national level.
We realize something actually. One of the biggest problems with Prop 13 is not just that it cut the amount of taxes that come in, but it shifted the whole level of decisions to the state level. It's hard to remember this, but the year before I got elected to public office in the city of Santa Cruz, the way they used to make a budget was they'd start off with the expense side of the budget. What do we think we want to do? Which things are we doing that we don't want to do anymore because they don't make any sense? What new things would we like to provide the public? And they come up with a budget, and then they figured out what kind of tax rate do you need on $100 of value of property to be able to raise enough money to fund this expense budget we just passed. And they did that for the last 80 years before that. I've gone back that far, maybe before that, I don't know. And then when Prop 13 passed, It all went to the state. The state now tells you how much revenue you have coming in. You start by looking at how much revenue you've got, and then you figure out what can we get with that amount of revenue, not all the things we want to have. And as soon as you're elected to public office, the first thing you get to do is not meet the promises that you gave everybody, but figure out what you're going to start cutting to make government work. And that's a pathetic situation to be in, and we need to raise more revenue to not have that situation obtained.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for